There is a person you have almost certainly met, or at least watched from a distance, who makes discipline look effortless. They train before sunrise. They write every morning. They keep the same routine in January and in August, when nobody is watching and nothing is due. And here is the part that quietly infuriates everyone else. They do not appear to be suffering. They are not gritting their teeth. They are not white-knuckling their way through a checklist. If you ask them how they force themselves to do it, they will usually look confused, because from the inside it does not feel like force at all. It feels like a preference. Meanwhile, you have tried. You have set alarms and made plans and written the list on Sunday night with real conviction. And by Wednesday, the list is a small monument to a person you were briefly pretending to be. The standard explanation for this gap is that they want it more, that they have grit, character, willpower, an internal engine you were not issued, that discipline is fundamentally a test of endurance, and some people simply endure better. That explanation is not just wrong, it is backwards. Because the disciplined person is not enduring more than you. In most cases, they are enduring far less. Something in their nervous system has been quietly reconfigured so that the behavior that costs you enormous effort costs them almost none. They are not winning the fight. They stopped having the fight. The work of neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky, particularly in Behave, the biology of humans at our best and worst, points to why. Your brain is not a machine for doing what is good for you. It is a machine for predicting where reward is likely to come from, and then pulling you towards it. It runs on forecasts. And discipline, as most people attempt it, is a behavior with no forecast attached. You are asking a prediction engine to invest heavily in something it has been given no reason to expect anything from. So it refuses. Not out of laziness, out of arithmetic. But this cuts both ways. Because if your brain can be trained to expect nothing from effort, it can also be trained to expect something. The signal that makes you crave a cigarette, a notification, a plate of food, is not sacred, and it is not fixed. It is a learned association, and learned associations can be moved. That is what this video is about, not how to force yourself, how to relocate the craving. We are going to go through 6 mechanisms, each one grounded in how the dopamine system actually operates, rather than how motivational culture imagines it operates. And by the end, you will understand something that sounds absurd right now, and will sound obvious later. You were never meant to like discipline. You were meant to make discipline predictive. The liking follows on its own. Your brain is not your enemy here. It is a very fast, very literal student that has been learning from the wrong evidence for years. Let us change the evidence. Start with the model almost everyone is running, because it needs to be dismantled before anything else can be built. The model says discipline is a quantity, a reservoir. You have a certain amount, you spend it on hard things, and if you run out before the hard thing is done, you have failed. Under this model, becoming more disciplined means enlarging the reservoir, suffering better, wanting harder. Notice what this model assumes, that the difficulty is fixed and only your tolerance is variable. The cold water is always going to be cold. The only question is how long you can stand in it. This is why so much advice in this space is essentially exhortation. Get up, push through, no excuses. It is loud, it feels true, and it works for about 9 days, because it is attacking the only variable it believes exists. But the brain does not treat effort as neutral. It treats effort as a cost, and it prices that cost the way it prices any other loss. Researchers studying effort-based decision-making describe this as effort discounting. Offer a person a reward, then attach a physical or cognitive cost to obtaining it, and the perceived value of that reward drops in proportion to the work required. The reward has not changed. Only the path to it has, and the brain quietly marks the whole package down. This is not a defect. Energy was the scarcest resource in the environment your nervous system was built for. An organism that spent effort casually, without a strong expected return, did not survive to become your ancestor. Conservation was not weakness, it was competence. So when you sit down to do difficult work, your brain runs the calculation it has always run. What does this cost, and what does it return, and when? The cost is immediate, physical and obvious. Attention, discomfort, the specific unpleasantness of being bad at something in real time. The return is abstract, distant and unverified. A body you might have in a year, a skill you might possess eventually, a business that might work. Sapolsky's core insight across his work is that the brain evolved to solve for survival and reproduction, not for fulfillment. It was never optimized for the kind of long-horizon, deferred return project that modern life consists almost entirely of. It is superb at getting you through today. It is close to indifferent about the version of you that exists in 3 years, because for most of evolutionary history, there was no reliable way to know that version would exist at all. Which means that when you fail to be disciplined, you are not failing a test of character. You are receiving an accurate answer to the question you asked. You asked a cost-benefit engine to authorize a large immediate expenditure against an unverified future return, and it declined. Willpower, in this framing, is what happens when you override the engine manually. And overriding anything manually is expensive, unreliable, and impossible to sustain across years. Elite performers do not override more often. They override less. They have arranged things so the engine approves the transaction on its own. The obvious question is how. If the brain only moves towards what it expects to be rewarding, and difficult work is not experienced as rewarding, how does anyone ever get to the point where it is? The answer sits in the single most misunderstood molecule in popular neuroscience. Everyone has heard of dopamine. Almost nobody knows what it actually does, and what it actually does is the entire mechanism by which discipline becomes something you want rather than something you survive. For decades, dopamine was described as the pleasure chemical. Something good happens, dopamine floods the system, you feel the reward. Simple. It is also wrong, and the experiment that broke it is one of the most quietly important in modern neuroscience. In work carried out by Wolfram Schultz and colleagues, monkeys were trained on a straightforward arrangement. A signal appeared. Shortly afterwards, juice arrived. Electrodes recorded activity from dopamine neurons throughout. At the beginning, exactly what you would predict. The juice arrives, the dopamine neurons fire. Reward, response. Then the animals learned the pattern, and the firing moved. Once the association was established, the dopamine burst no longer occurred when the juice arrived. It occurred when the signal appeared. The moment of maximum dopaminergic activity had migrated backwards in time, away from the reward itself, and onto the cue that predicted it. Sit with how strange this is. The reward had not changed. The pleasure of the juice was presumably identical, but the system that supposedly encoded that pleasure had stopped responding to it, and had attached itself instead to a piece of information. And it went further. Once the cue reliably predicted juice, delivering the juice produced almost no dopamine response at all. But withhold it, and activity dropped sharply below baseline. The system was not tracking reward. It was tracking the gap between what was expected and what occurred. This is what neuroscientists call reward prediction error, and it is, as Sapolsky describes it, close to the brain's fundamental learning rule. Better than expected, a burst, and the associated behavior is reinforced. Exactly as expected, silence. Worse than expected, a dip, and the association is weakened. Dopamine is not the feeling of getting. It is the anticipation of getting, and the constant updating of that anticipation against reality. 3 consequences follow, and each one explains a specific failure you have personally experienced. First, dopamine is about pursuit rather than satisfaction. This is why the anticipation of the holiday is sharper than the holiday, why the moment before the message opens is more charged than the message. The system is built to move you towards things, and it stops paying out once you have arrived. Second, and this is the one that matters most here, knowing something is good for you produces no dopamine at all. Your intellectual understanding that the gym is valuable is stored somewhere entirely different from the prediction machinery that actually generates motivation. You can hold a completely accurate model of your own best interests and feel not one flicker of pull towards it. This is not hypocrisy. These are separate systems, and only one of them moves your body. Third, and this is the opening, prediction is learned. The monkey was not born responding to the signal. The signal became meaningful because it was reliably followed by something good, over and over, until the brain reassigned the anticipatory charge onto it. which means the charge is transferable. The cue that currently makes you reach for your phone was, at some point, a neutral object. It acquired its power the same way the signal in that laboratory acquired its power, through repetition and reliable payoff. Nothing about that process is unique to phones, or food, or anything else that currently hijacks you. If a neutral thing can become a craving through consistent pairing with reward, then the act of sitting down to work is a neutral thing that can become a craving through consistent pairing with reward. The question is what you pair it with, and where in the sequence you place the payoff, because most people put the reward in the wrong location entirely, and then wonder why the wanting never shows up. Think about how you have structured every attempt at discipline you have ever made. The reward is at the end. Finish the workout, then feel good. Complete the chapter, then feel accomplished. Get through the year, then have the body, the business, the skill. This is intuitive, morally satisfying, and neurologically backwards. Because if the dopamine signal migrates onto whatever reliably predicts the payoff, and the payoff is located at the far end of a long, uncomfortable process, then there is nothing in the early part of that process for the signal to attach to. The brain is looking for a cue to charge up. You have not given it one. Worse, you have front-loaded the cost. The first 10 minutes of any demanding task are the most aversive part. Cold muscles, a blank page, the friction of switching states. So the sequence your brain actually learns is, this cue predicts discomfort, and the good part is so far away it barely registers as connected. No wonder starting is impossible. You have accidentally trained an aversion to the entrance. Notice something about your own experience, though. Once you are 20 minutes into the work, it is usually fine, sometimes better than fine. Almost nobody quits at minute 20. They quit at minute 0, repeatedly, for weeks. Which tells you the problem was never the work. It was the doorway. So move the reward to the doorway. This means deliberately attaching something pleasurable, immediate, and reliable to the act of beginning, not to the act of completing. The specific coffee that only exists at the desk, the album that only plays on the walk to the gym, the particular chair, the particular light, the specific small ritual that happens nowhere else in your life. This is not indulgence, and it is not bribery. You are manufacturing a cue. You are building, by hand, the thing the monkey had built for it by the experimenter, a reliable signal that something good is imminent. Do it consistently, and the migration happens on its own. Within a few weeks, the ritual itself begins carrying the charge. People report this constantly, without understanding the mechanism, describing how they now feel restless if they miss their morning session, how the routine has started to want itself. That is not virtue arriving. That is a prediction signal completing its transfer. The second half of this is lowering the cost of entry to something close to trivial. If the brain is running effort discounting, then reducing the perceived effort at the threshold changes the calculation directly, which is why the most effective commitment is almost always absurdly small. 2 minutes of writing, one set, put on the shoes and step outside, nothing more. People hear this and object that 2 minutes accomplishes nothing. Correct. Accomplishment is not the point. The 2 minutes is not the workout. The 2 minutes is the cue, and the cue is what you are actually building. And there is a quiet mechanical bonus. Starting is the expensive part. Continuing, once started, is close to free, which is why the 2-minute commitment so often becomes 40 minutes, and why the people insisting this is a trick they would see through are usually the people who have not done it. You are not tricking yourself about the work. You are removing the toll booth in front of it. If this is landing, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people who need this, and it costs you nothing. Now, moving the reward to the front door solves the problem of starting. But it does not solve the deeper one, because even when you start reliably, the actual goal is still months away, and your brain still cannot see it. Here is the structural problem with every goal worth having. The feedback is catastrophically delayed. You train today. Your body looks identical tomorrow, and the day after, and for weeks. You write today, and you are not a better writer tomorrow in any way you can detect. You do the difficult, correct, compounding thing, and the universe returns absolutely nothing to confirm it. Now recall what dopamine actually encodes. Prediction error, the gap between expected and received. And what did you receive today, immediately, in response to your effort? Nothing. To a system built on immediate feedback, an action that produces no detectable outcome is not a neutral event. It is evidence against. Effort spent, nothing returned, association weakened. Do that for 3 weeks, and the brain has learned, with perfect accuracy given the information available, that this behavior does not pay. This is temporal discounting, operating at close to full strength. Value decays steeply with delay. A reward 6 months out is not worth slightly less to your motivational system. It is worth almost nothing, because for most of the history of the organism you are, 6 months out was speculative fiction. You cannot argue your way past this. You can, however, manufacture evidence. That is what tracking actually is. Not productivity theater, not self-surveillance. It is the deliberate creation of a same-day outcome where biology failed to provide one. The mark on the calendar is not a record of the workout. It is the reward for the workout, delivered within seconds, in a form the brain can actually register. The word count, the completed rep log, the chain of unbroken days, these are synthetic prediction signals inserted into a gap that would otherwise stay empty. And the brain does not seem to care much that they are synthetic. Give it a small, visible, immediate confirmation that the action produced a result, and it will begin building the association it would never have built from the distant outcome alone, which is exactly why streaks are so disproportionately powerful, and why breaking one hurts out of all proportion to the actual loss. The streak has become the reward. The fitness is a side effect. There is a related effect worth exploiting. Research on the goal gradient effect, including a well-known study of coffee shop loyalty cards, found that people accelerate as they approach a target, buying more frequently the closer they get to a free drink. Notably, cards that came pre-stamped with a couple of free marks produced faster completion than shorter cards requiring the same actual number of purchases. Perceived proximity to completion changed behavior, even when the real work was identical. The practical translation is direct. Make progress visible, make targets close, and never leave a long stretch of effort with no marker in it. Break the year into weeks. Break the project into units that complete. Give yourself something that finishes today. There is one caveat worth stating plainly, because the internet has turned tracking into an identity. The metric is a tool for building the association, not a replacement for the outcome. When people begin optimizing the streak at the expense of the actual work, logging junk words, going through the motions to preserve the chain, the tool has captured the goal. Watch for it. Used properly, though, this closes the feedback gap. Effort produces something. Today. But there is a further step available, and it is stranger. Because it turns out the brain can be taught to treat the effort itself, the difficulty, the exertion, as the rewarding part. Not the marker, not the outcome, the strain. Everything so far treats effort as a cost to be compensated for. Pair it with something pleasant, prove it produced something, offset the price. But there is a body of research suggesting the price itself is not fixed. In the early 1990s, the psychologist Robert Eisenberger described a phenomenon he called learned industriousness. The finding, across a range of studies, was that when effort is consistently followed by reward, the sensation of effort begins acquiring reward properties of its own. Subjects trained on high-effort tasks with reliable payoff subsequently persisted longer on entirely unrelated difficult tasks. Something transferred, and it was not skill. What transferred was a general willingness to strain, because straining had become associated with good outcomes. Consider what that implies. Effort is not inherently aversive. Effort is a signal, and like every other signal in the prediction system, its meaning is learned. Pair it consistently with nothing, and it becomes a cost. Pair it consistently with reward, and it starts to acquire the charge. This is where the person you envy at the beginning of this video actually is. They are not tolerating effort better. Effort has been repaired for them into something closer to appetite. There is supporting evidence from an unexpected direction. Work on what researchers named the IKEA effect found that people place higher value on objects they assembled themselves than on identical pre-assembled versions. The labor did not improve the product, it increased the valuation. Related research on what has been called the effort paradox has gathered a wide set of findings pointing the same way. Under certain conditions, effort does not merely earn value, it adds value. The struggle becomes part of what makes the thing worth having. This is not mysticism. It is the same prediction machinery running on a different input. Effort has been a reliable precursor to reward, so effort now carries anticipatory charge, so effort feels like approach rather than avoidance. The practical question is how to install it, and the answer is uncomfortable in its simplicity. You have to complete difficult things consistently and make sure they are followed by something good. Every abandoned attempt teaches the opposite lesson. Effort spent, nothing returned. Every completed one teaches that strain predicts payoff, which reframes early consistency entirely. The first month of any new practice is not about results. It is a training set. You are supplying your prediction system with examples, and the examples need to be small enough that you can guarantee completion, because an incomplete example teaches the wrong thing. This is the strongest argument against starting hard. Not that ambitious starts are exhausting, though they are. It is that they generate failed repetitions, and failed repetitions are not neutral. They are direct instruction that effort in this domain does not pay. Start at a level you cannot fail. Let the association build. Escalate only when the pull has appeared. Now, everything covered so far assumes the reward is dependable. Consistent pairing, reliable payoff, stable association. But the most powerful dopamine response in the entire system does not occur under reliable conditions. It occurs under uncertain ones. And once you understand that, most of what you believe about discipline inverts. Return to the laboratory, because there is a result there that changes the shape of this entire argument. Once a cue reliably predicts a reward, the dopamine response to that reward largely disappears. Fully expected outcomes generate almost no signal. This is why the 10th time is never the first time, and why anything guaranteed eventually goes flat. So the researchers varied the odds. Instead of the cue always producing juice, it produced juice some of the time. 50%, and they watched what the dopamine neurons did. In work by Fiorillo, Tobler, and Schultz, alongside the phasic burst at the cue, a second pattern emerged. A sustained ramp of dopamine activity across the delay period, rising towards the moment of resolution. And that sustained signal was largest, not when reward was certain, and not when it was rare, but when the probability sat around 50%. Maximum uncertainty, maximum signal. Sapolsky discusses this directly and states the implication bluntly. The most dopaminergically powerful word available to the human brain is not yes, it is maybe. This is the engine underneath every slot machine ever built, not the winning. Nobody would sit at a machine that paid out every time, and nobody would sit at one that never paid at all. The pull is the interval of not knowing. The lever is pulled for the ramp, and the ramp only exists when the outcome is genuinely in doubt. And this is where the argument turns, because look at what that means for the things you are trying to force yourself to do. Consider the actual structure of meaningful work. You train, and most sessions produce nothing visible, and occasionally something shifts. You write, and most days produce serviceable material, and unpredictably a paragraph arrives that is better than you are. You build, and most weeks are silence, and then, without warning, something lands. That is not a broken reward schedule. That is a variable ratio reward schedule. Structurally, it is the exact profile that makes slot machines difficult to leave. The most compulsively engaging arrangement the reward system is capable of responding to, sitting inside the activities everyone believes require iron discipline to sustain. Here is the twist, and it is the point this entire video has been walking towards. Difficult, meaningful work is not less rewarding than the distractions competing with it. In terms of raw reward architecture, it is more rewarding. The unpredictability that makes it feel discouraging early on is the same property that makes it grip you permanently later. The problem is that slot machines resolve in 3 seconds, and creative work resolves in 3 months. The schedule is identical, the timescale is not, and almost everyone quits during the stretch of losses before the pattern ever gets a chance to establish. so they never reach the point where the ramp exists. Which reframes the goal completely. You are not building endurance. You are surviving long enough for the variable schedule to install itself. And that is what everything in this video is for. The entry ritual gets you through the door. The tracking supplies evidence during the dry stretches. The completed small repetitions teach your system that effort predicts payoff. None of these are the destination. They are scaffolding, holding the structure up long enough for the real mechanism to take hold. Once it does, you will notice something. You stop being able to predict which session will be the good one. And you will show up anyway, specifically because you cannot predict it. That is what the disciplined person has that you do not. Not willpower, a live prediction signal, and an outcome they cannot forecast, which is precisely why they keep pulling the lever. There is one more lever, and it operates from a different direction entirely. The psychologist Daryl Bem proposed something in the 1960s that still unsettles people. Self-perception theory holds that we do not have reliable direct access to our own attitudes. Instead, we infer them, largely the way an outside observer would, by watching our own behavior and reasoning backwards. You do not consult an internal record and discover you are a person who trains. You watch yourself train, repeatedly, and conclude it. This means the arrow you assumed points one way, points the other. You believed identity produces behavior. Become disciplined, then act disciplined. But a substantial amount of the traffic runs in reverse. Behavior produces identity, act, and the brain updates its model of who is acting. The practical consequence is significant because self-concept is one of the cheapest sources of consistency available. Behavior that contradicts identity generates friction on its own, without any decision being made. Someone who has concluded they are a person who does not smoke is not resisting cigarettes all day. The option simply does not surface. That is the state you want, not a stronger opposition, a smaller menu. And it is built out of small, consistent evidence, not large, sporadic evidence. One enormous effort produces almost no identity update, because you can dismiss it as unusual. 20 ordinary repetitions produce a large one, because the pattern is undeniable, which is another reason the 2-minute version outperforms the heroic version. It is not just easier, it generates more instances, and instances are what the inference runs on. There is a specific technique that sits well alongside this. Peter Gollwitzer's research on implementation intentions found that specifying when and where a behavior will occur, if situation X arises, then I will do Y, substantially improved follow-through compared with goal intentions alone. The mechanism is straightforward. A vague intention requires a decision at the moment of action, and the moment of action is precisely when your prediction system is arguing for something easier. A specified trigger removes the decision. The situation arrives and the behavior is already assigned to it. You are not strengthening yourself for the confrontation. You are canceling the confrontation. Stack these together and the picture completes. Small actions, specified in advance so no decision is required, repeated often enough that the brain infers an identity from them, at which point the behavior stops feeling like something you make yourself do and starts feeling like something you are. One caution, since it comes up. Identity built this way is durable but not weightless. Attached too tightly to a single practice, it makes injury, interruption, or change genuinely destabilizing. Hold it as something you do consistently, rather than something you must never fail at, or the tool starts running you. Now, one variable remains, and it can undo everything above, because all of this assumes a functioning prefrontal cortex, and there are entirely predictable conditions under which yours is not available at all. Everything discussed so far is architecture. This last piece is about the conditions under which the architecture holds. The prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with planning, inhibition, and long-horizon decisions, is metabolically expensive and unusually sensitive to physiological state. It is not equally available across the day, and it is not equally available across conditions. This is Sapolsky's home territory. Much of his career, including the long-running baboon fieldwork, concerned what sustained stress does to the body and brain. The general finding is that acute stress is adaptive, and short-term stress can sharpen performance, but sustained elevation of glucocorticoids impairs exactly the regions you depend on for self-regulation. prefrontal function degrades. Habitual, reactive responding takes over. Add sleep deprivation, which independently reduces prefrontal efficiency, and you arrive at a completely predictable state, a person operating almost entirely on defaults, who will interpret their evening collapse as a personal failing. It is not a failing. It is a resource condition. Two consequences follow. First, protect the window. For most people, prefrontal capacity is highest in the earlier part of the waking day, though genuine chronotype variation exists and some people run several hours later. Whichever applies to you, the important thing is that the window exists and is finite, and that most people spend it entirely on trivial input, messages, feeds, other people's priorities. By the time the important work is scheduled, the machinery it required has been spent on nothing. Put the demanding work inside the window, not because mornings are virtuous, because that is when the relevant hardware is running. Second, and more importantly, stop testing discipline in degraded states and drawing conclusions from the result. You are not learning anything true about yourself when you fail at 11 at night after a difficult day on 5 hours of sleep. That is not a measurement of your character. That is a measurement of a depleted prefrontal cortex, and the result would be roughly the same for anyone. The mistake is not the failure. The mistake is what you conclude from it. Every time you decide the collapse proves something about who you are, you have taken a physiological reading and filed it as evidence of a defect. That story then does its own damage, because a person who believes they lack discipline has very little reason to keep supplying their prediction system with new examples. So treat sleep, stress, and scheduling as part of the system, rather than as background conditions. They are not adjacent to discipline. On many days, they are the entire explanation for whether it appeared. Pull the whole thing together, because these are not 6 separate tips. They are one mechanism seen from 6 angles. Your brain moves you towards what it predicts will pay. Discipline fails when there is no prediction attached to it, and succeeds when there is. Everything covered here is a method for attaching one. Move the reward to the entrance, so beginning carries the charge instead of the cost. Shrink the feedback gap, so effort produces visible evidence on the same day it was spent. Complete small, difficult things reliably, until the sensation of effort itself becomes a signal of approaching reward rather than a signal of loss. Stay in long enough for the variable schedule to establish, because unpredictable payoff is not the weakness of meaningful work, it is the source of its grip. Let repetition build identity, so the behavior stops requiring a decision. And protect the physiological conditions under which any of this is possible, rather than testing yourself at your worst and calling the result a verdict. None of this is about becoming a harder person. It is close to the opposite. Every one of these mechanisms exists to reduce the amount of force required, until the force required approaches 0, and the thing you have been fighting yourself over becomes something you would have to be stopped from doing. That is what the disciplined person actually has. Not a larger reservoir of endurance. A prediction system pointed at something better. You were never supposed to like discipline through sheer determination. You were supposed to make discipline predictive and let the liking arrive on its own, the way it arrived for every habit you currently have and never chose. Your brain is not resisting you. It is learning, constantly, from whatever evidence it is given. Start giving it different evidence. So tell me, which of these 6 is the one you have been getting wrong? The entrance, the feedback gap, the effort itself, the uncertainty, the identity, or the state you attempted in? Put it in the comments. I read them, and the answers people give here are consistently more interesting than the video.